May 15th, 1940. Squadron Leader stands beside his Hurricane at RAF Northolt, watching through the dawn mist as 12 Spitfires from 601 Squadron taxi into formation. They assemble into 4 tight V-shapes, each aircraft barely 50 feet from the next, wingtip to wingtip. The Squadron Leader watches his wingmen concentrate furiously just to avoid collision, their eyes locked on their leader's aircraft instead of scanning the sky for threats. He knows what's coming. The Luftwaffe fighter pilots have been exploiting this weakness for months. While RAF pilots fly in these rigid Vics, focusing all their attention inward just to maintain formation, German Messerschmitts position themselves behind and above, picking off stragglers with methodical efficiency. The mathematics are brutal. RAF Fighter Command is losing pilots faster than they can train replacements, and it's not because British aircraft are inferior. It's because RAF formations were designed for an era when fighters had no radios, and pilots needed to fly close enough to see hand signals. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This wasn't unique to Britain. In May 1940, every major air force in the world, except 2, flew variations of the same close formation inherited from World War I. The French flew in tight Vs, the Americans trained in compact 3-plane elements, the Soviets used rigid delta formations, and they were all wrong. The Germans had discovered something that would revolutionize air combat forever, a formation so simple, so effective, that it would eventually be adopted by every air force in the world and remain standard doctrine for the next 20 years. They called it the Swarm. The Finns, who developed it independently, called it the Parvi. English-speaking pilots would come to call it the Finger 4, because from above, the 4 aircraft resembled the fingertips of an outstretched hand. The Finger 4 formation didn't win the air war because it was complicated. It won because it solved a problem that every other air force had ignored. Fighter pilots needed to see the enemy before the enemy saw them. Everything else was secondary. But in 1940, most fighter pilots spent their time watching their wingmen instead of watching for threats. The standard RAF fighter formation in 1940 was the Vic, 3 aircraft flying in a tight V-shape with the leader at the point and 2 wingmen tucked in close on either side. A squadron of 12 Spitfires would be divided into 4 Vics, flying in a formation that looked impressive on parade but was tactically obsolete. The aircraft flew so close together, often just 40 to 60 feet apart, that the wingmen spent their entire mission focused on one task, not colliding with their leader. The inside wingman during a turn had to throttle back constantly to avoid overshooting. The outside wingman had to push his throttle forward to keep up. Neither could spare attention to scan for enemy fighters. That job fell entirely to the section leader, who himself was busy navigating, watching for the enemy, and trying not to fly into anyone. The Luftwaffe fighter pilots called these formations Idiotenreihen, rows of idiots. German ace Werner Mölders, who had pioneered the Finger 4 over Spain in 1938, described attacking RAF Vics with cold precision in his combat reports. "The English fly too close together," he wrote in June 1940. "Their wingmen cannot look around. They concentrate only on formation keeping. We position ourselves in the sun above them and select the aircraft flying in the rear. Often we can shoot down 2 or 3 before they even know we are there." The problem wasn't courage. RAF pilots in 1940 were fighting with extraordinary bravery against an enemy that had spent 3 years perfecting its tactics over Spain. The problem was that pre-war RAF doctrine prioritized formation discipline and synchronized attacks over situational awareness. Fighter tactics manuals from 1938 emphasized tight formation flying as essential for coordinated assaults on enemy bombers. The theory was that a formation of fighters approaching an enemy bomber could concentrate their firepower if they stayed together in a tight group. This might have made sense if the primary threat was unescorted bombers, but over France in May and June 1940, and later over southern England during the Battle of Britain, RAF fighters faced German fighter escorts that exploited every weakness in the Vic formation. The Germans weren't flying tight Vics. They were flying in pairs, with each pair separated by 200 yards or more, stacked vertically so they could cover each other while maintaining 360-degree awareness of the surrounding airspace. The fundamental problem with the VIC formation was psychological and mechanical. Fighter pilots are taught from their first training flight that mid-air collisions are catastrophic and must be avoided at all costs. When you're flying 60 feet from another aircraft at 250 miles per hour, your brain's survival instinct screams at you to watch that aircraft. Every slight movement by the leader demands instant correction from the wingmen. A shift in altitude, a change in speed, a turn, all require the wingmen to adjust constantly or risk collision. This left the wingmen with almost no capacity to scan for threats. Studies conducted by RAF Fighter Command in 1941, after the Battle of Britain, revealed that wingmen in tight VIC formations spent an average of 85% of their time watching their leader and only 15% scanning for enemy aircraft. Section leaders, who had more freedom to look around, still spent roughly 40% of their time monitoring their wingmen's positions. The tactical disadvantage was enormous. In aerial combat, the pilot who sees the enemy first usually wins. Fighter pilots in World War II described combat as 90% vigilance and 10% violence. Most fighter kills occurred when one pilot spotted the enemy before being seen himself, positioned himself advantageously, usually diving from above with the sun behind him, and fired before the target could react. German fighter pilots called this bouncing, the art of attacking from an unseen position. RAF pilots flying in tight VICs were almost impossible to bounce from certain angles, but only because they presented such tempting targets from others. A German pilot approaching from behind and above, the classic bounce position, faced minimal defensive fire because the RAF fighters couldn't see him coming. By the time the section leader spotted the threat and called a warning, the German was already firing. The casualty statistics from the Battle of France were catastrophic. Between May 10th and June 22nd, 1940, RAF Fighter Command lost 453 Hurricanes and Spitfires. Nearly half of those losses came from fighters bounced by German aircraft they never saw. Post-combat interrogations of surviving pilots revealed a consistent pattern. Most pilots shot down reported they had no warning before the attack. They were flying in formation, concentrating on maintaining position, when cannon fire tore through their aircraft. The few squadrons that experimented with looser formations during the Battle of France reported markedly better results. Number 1, Squadron, equipped with Hurricanes, adopted a spread-out line-astern formation after losing 5 aircraft in a single engagement on May 10th. Their loss rate immediately dropped. 611 Squadron, flying Spitfires, began flying with greater spacing between aircraft after their squadron leader, a veteran of the Spanish Civil War, argued that the tight formations were suicidal. But these were isolated experiments. RAF Fighter Command doctrine still mandated tight VIC formations, and most squadron commanders followed orders. The official line was that formation discipline was essential for coordinated attacks, and that tight formations provided mutual support. The reality was that tight formations provided targets. The Germans, meanwhile, had abandoned tight formations entirely. Their basic tactical unit was the Rotte, a pair of fighters consisting of a leader and a wingman. The Rottenführer, or pair leader, would search for targets and lead attacks. His wingman flew approximately 200 yards to one side and slightly behind, positioned to cover the leader's blind spots, particularly the vulnerable 6 o'clock position directly behind the aircraft. The wingman's primary job wasn't to attack, it was to protect his leader and warn him of threats. If an enemy aircraft approached the leader, the wingman would call it out immediately and often turn to engage, forcing the attacker to break off or face being shot down himself. This mutual protection was far more effective than any tight formation because both pilots could scan continuously for threats without worrying about collision. 2 Rotten combined to form a swarm, 4 aircraft that the English-speaking world would call the Finger Four. The lead Rotte flew in front, with the leader slightly ahead of his wingman. The second Rotte flew to the right and slightly behind, also with the element leader ahead of his wingman. From above, this arrangement looked like 4 fingertips on a spread hand, hence the name. The spacing was critical. Aircraft in a swarm flew 200 to 300 yards apart horizontally and were staggered vertically by several hundred feet. This wide spacing had multiple advantages. First, it eliminated the constant attention needed to avoid collision, freeing every pilot to scan for threats. Second, it covered much more airspace, making it harder for enemy fighters to approach unseen. Third, it allowed for flexible tactics. The swarm could split into two rotten at any time, with each pair operating independently while still providing mutual support. Most importantly, the Finger Four formation encouraged aggressive, flexible combat. German doctrine emphasized that the pilot who spotted the enemy first should immediately become the tactical leader for that engagement, regardless of rank. If the number 4 wingman, the least experienced pilot in the formation, spotted enemy fighters first, he would call them out and lead the attack because he had the best situational awareness at that moment. The official leader would follow his wingman's lead until the tactical situation changed. This was revolutionary. In RAF and French formations, only the section leader made tactical decisions. Wingmen were expected to follow orders without question. German pilots, by contrast, were trained to think independently and seize initiative. This cultural difference, combined with the tactical advantages of the Finger Four formation, made Luftwaffe fighter units devastatingly effective in the early years of the war. The Finns had arrived at the same solution independently, and for the same reason. In the early 1930s, the Finnish Air Force faced a strategic problem. Finland had a tiny air force compared to its massive neighbour, the Soviet Union. In any war with the Soviets, Finnish pilots would be outnumbered 10-1 or worse. The only way to survive was to maximize the effectiveness of each pilot and each aircraft. Finnish Air Force commanders, particularly those who had studied aerial combat in World War I, recognized that tight formations wasted pilots. If you only had 40 fighters to defend your entire country, you couldn't afford to have wingmen spending all their time watching formation instead of fighting. So, between 1934 and 1935, the Finnish Air Force developed and adopted what they called the Parvi formation. 2 fighters flying as a pair, with wide spacing and mutual support, combined into a 4-plane section that gave every pilot freedom to scan and fight. The Finns also adopted a tactical philosophy that was radical for its time. They emphasized aggression over caution, shooting accuracy over aerobatic skill, and individual initiative over rigid obedience. Finnish fighter pilots were taught to attack regardless of odds, to trust their wingmen absolutely, and to break formation instantly if they spotted a better tactical opportunity. When the Soviet Union invaded Finland on November 30th, 1939, starting the Winter War, the Finnish Air Force put its new tactics to the test. The results were extraordinary. Finnish fighter pilots achieved a 16-1 kill ratio against the Soviet Air Force. For every Finnish fighter shot down, Soviet forces lost 16 aircraft. This wasn't because Finnish aircraft were superior. Most Finnish fighters were obsolete Bristol Bulldogs and Fokker D-21s, slower and less powerful than the Soviet Polikarpov I-16s they faced. The difference was tactics. Soviet pilots flew in tight 3-plane Vics, just like the RAF. They concentrated on formation keeping instead of situational awareness. Finnish pilots, flying in loose pairs and 4-plane sections, saw them coming, positioned themselves advantageously, and struck before the Soviets could react. One Finnish ace, Jorma Sarvanto, demonstrated the effectiveness of Finnish tactics on January 6, 1940, flying a Fokker D-21, hopelessly outmatched by faster Soviet fighters. Sarvanto spotted a formation of Soviet bombers and their fighter escort while flying alone. Instead of breaking off, he attacked immediately from an advantageous position. In 4 minutes, he shot down 6 Soviet bombers. His success came not from superior equipment, but from superior awareness and aggression, the core principles of Finger Four tactics. The Germans learned the same lessons in Spain. When the Luftwaffe deployed to support Franco's nationalist forces in the Spanish Civil War, their fighter tactics were little better than anyone else's. They flew in 3-plane ketters, tight V formations inherited from World War I, and suffered frustrating losses to Republican pilots flying Soviet I-16 fighters. The Spanish experience taught the Luftwaffe that their pre-war tactics were obsolete. Tight formations didn't work against modern fighters. Radio communication made hand signals unnecessary, and modern aircraft were too fast to fly safely in close formation for extended periods without exhausting pilots. In March 1938, a 24-year-old Luftwaffe lieutenant named Werner Mulders arrived in Spain to take command of the 3rd Staffel of Jagdgruppe 88. Mulders was not a high-ranking officer. He was a first lieutenant and a replacement squadron commander, filling in for Adolf Galland, who was rotating back to Germany. But Mulders would revolutionize fighter tactics in a way that would shape aerial combat for the next 3 decades. Mulders arrived in Spain at a time when the Luftwaffe's main fighter aircraft, the Heinkel He-51 biplane, was being replaced by the new Messerschmitt Bf-109. The Bf-109 was fast, heavily armed, and far more capable than anything Republican forces could field. But Luftwaffe pilots were struggling to use it effectively because they were still flying in outdated 3-plane Ketis. The immediate problem was practical. The Condor Legion often had only 6 Bf-109s available at any given time. Traditional Ket formations required aircraft in multiples of 3. With 6 aircraft, you could form 2 Kets. With 7 aircraft, you either left 1 plane on the ground or broke doctrine. Mulders solved this by flying in pairs. Instead of 3-plane Vics, his unit would fly 2-plane Rotten. 2 Rotten would combine to form a 4-plane Schwarm. But the solution wasn't just about numbers. Mulders had recognized what Finnish commanders and a handful of other tacticians around the world were discovering independently. Modern fighters equipped with radios didn't need to fly in tight formation. Pilots could communicate by radio, coordinate attacks by radio, and warn each other of threats by radio. Tight formations were a relic of an era when visual signals were the only option. Mulders began training his pilots in the new tactics. The Rotte would fly with approximately 200 yards of separation, far enough apart that neither pilot worried about collision, close enough that each could support the other instantly. The leader would focus on navigation and target acquisition. The wingman would focus on protecting the leader's blind spots, particularly the vulnerable area behind and below. 2 Rotten would form a Schwarm, with even wider spacing. The lead Rotte would fly in front and slightly lower. The second Rotte would fly to the right, higher, and behind. This diagonal staggering meant that every pilot had a clear field of view in multiple directions, and any enemy aircraft approaching the formation would be visible to at least 2 pilots simultaneously. The vertical separation was just as important as the horizontal spacing. By flying at different altitudes, the aircraft could cover each other's blind spots more effectively. A fighter attacking from below would be spotted by the high Rotte. A fighter diving from above would be seen by the low Rotte. And because the formation was loose, any pilot could maneuver aggressively without endangering his wingman. Mulders also developed the crossover turn, a maneuver that allowed the Schwarm to change direction quickly without breaking formation. In a traditional tight Vic, turns were dangerous because the inside aircraft had to slow down dramatically while the outside aircraft had to speed up, and any mistake could cause a collision. Mulders's Schwarm simply had each Rotte pivot 90 degrees and switch positions. The leader would turn, in one direction, his wingman would turn the opposite direction and take the lead position, and the formation would reassemble in seconds without anyone flying into anyone else. The first combat tests of these tactics came in July 1938. Mulders led his Schwarm against Republican fighters using traditional tight formations. The results were immediate and dramatic. Mulders and his pilots spotted enemy aircraft earlier, positioned themselves advantageously, and attacked before Republican pilots even knew they were there. Between July and November 1938, Mulders shot down 14 aircraft, making him the leading German ace of the Spanish Civil War. More importantly, his unit's loss rate dropped to nearly 0. German pilots flying in Schwarm formations simply weren't being bounced. They saw threats coming and evaded or attacked first. When Mulders completed his tour in December 1938 and returned to Germany, the Luftwaffe recognized that he'd discovered something revolutionary. He was assigned to the Fighter Inspectorate at the Ministry of Aviation with a specific mission: develop and teach these new tactics to the entire Luftwaffe fighter force. Over the next 9 months, Mulders trained squadron after squadron in Rotten and Schwarm tactics. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By the time Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, every Luftwaffe fighter unit was flying in the Finger Four formation. And by May 1940, when Germany invaded France and the Low Countries, Luftwaffe fighter pilots had 18 months of experience with tactics that their opponents had never seen before. The impact on the Battle of France was devastating. French and British fighter squadrons, still flying tight Vics and rigid formations, found themselves outmaneuvered and outfought by German pilots using tactics they didn't understand. RAF Fighter Command lost 453 aircraft in 6 weeks, and while pilot bravery prevented complete catastrophe, the tactical disadvantage was undeniable. By July 1940, when the Battle of Britain began, a few RAF squadron commanders were starting to question the Vic formation, but Fighter Command headquarters was conservative and reluctant to abandon established doctrine in the middle of a desperate battle for survival. Official tactical manuals still emphasized tight formation, flying as essential for discipline and coordinated attacks. The Battle of Britain would prove beyond any doubt that the Finger Four formation was superior, but that lesson would be written in blood, paid for by hundreds of young pilots who died because they were flying in formations that made them easy targets for an enemy who could see them coming long before they could respond. Part 2, July 10, 1940. The Battle of Britain officially begins. RAF Fighter Command can field approximately 640 operational Hurricanes and Spitfires. The Luftwaffe, flying from bases in France and Belgium, has nearly 1,400 Bf-109 and Bf-110 fighters available, plus hundreds of bombers. The numbers favour Germany, but numbers alone don't explain what happens over the next 4 months. RAF pilots flying in tight Vic formations consistently report being bounced by German fighters they never saw. Combat reports from July and August 1940 reveal a disturbing pattern. Section leaders would report enemy aircraft diving from above and behind, attacking wingmen before anyone could react. Wingmen, if they survived, would report suddenly finding themselves under fire with no warning. The Germans, meanwhile, were executing textbook bounces using Finger Four tactics perfected over Spain and Poland and France. A typical German attack began with altitude advantage. Luftwaffe fighters would climb to 30,000 feet or higher, positioning themselves above the RAF formations. From this height, they could see RAF squadrons below them, silhouetted against the ground or clouds. The loose Schwarm formation meant multiple German pilots were scanning continuously, so RAF formations were almost always spotted first. Once spotted, German pilots would position themselves with the sun behind them, making themselves nearly invisible to pilots looking up from below. Then they would dive, building speed to over 400 miles per hour, and attack. The dive attack gave them energy advantage, speed that could be converted to altitude or used to escape if the attack went wrong. They would fire a burst at close range, usually targeting the rearmost aircraft in the formation, and then zoom back up to altitude before RAF pilots could respond. From the German perspective, attacking RAF Vics was almost too easy. The target aircraft's wingmen were focused on formation keeping, not on scanning for threats. The section leader might spot the attack, but by the time he called a warning and his wingmen reacted, the German fighters were already firing. And because the Vic formation was tight, German pilots could be confident that their target couldn't maneuver aggressively without hitting one of his own wingmen. RAF pilots, trapped in these rigid formations, fought back with extraordinary courage but inadequate tactics. They knew something was wrong. Combat veterans could feel it, but Fighter Command headquarters was in the middle of an existential battle for Britain's survival and had no time or resources to completely restructure fighter tactics. The closest thing to an official solution was the Weaver, a single aircraft that would fly behind and above the squadron formation, zigzagging back and forth to watch for attacks from behind. The theory was that the Weaver would spot German fighters and warn the squadron before an attack developed. In practice, weavers became Germany's favourite targets. They were isolated from the main formation, easy to pick off, and usually died without being able to warn anyone. Post-war analysis would reveal that weavers had the highest casualty rate of any position in RAF formations. They were typically the newest, least experienced pilots, assigned to the most dangerous position because someone had to do it. Most didn't survive their first 5 missions. The tactic was so ineffective that by September 1940, many squadrons had quietly stopped using weavers, accepting reduced rear coverage rather than continuing to sacrifice inexperienced pilots in a role that accomplished nothing. August 1940 was the bloodiest month for Fighter Command. The Luftwaffe launched massive attacks against RAF airfields, attempting to destroy British fighter forces on the ground and in the air. RAF squadrons flew multiple sorties per day, often 4 or 5 missions in a single day, and losses mounted catastrophically. On August 13th alone, the Luftwaffe flew over 1,400 sorties against British targets. RAF Fighter Command lost 13 aircraft. The Germans lost 34, but many RAF pilots were flying their second or third mission of the day and were exhausted. The exhaustion compounded the tactical problems with tight formations. Flying in a Vic required constant concentration even when fresh. After several hours in the air, pilots struggled to maintain formation discipline. Aircraft would drift apart, gaps would open, the formation would become ragged, and once the formation loosened, it became even more vulnerable to German attacks. Some RAF squadrons had combat experience that taught them harsh lessons about formation flying. Number 603 Squadron, a City of Edinburgh squadron, had fought over France and returned to England with only 6 operational aircraft and 7 pilots. Their surviving pilots had learned that tight Vics were death traps. When they rebuilt and returned to combat over Britain, they flew with much looser spacing, prioritizing situational awareness over formation discipline. Number 1, Squadron, another veteran of France, had adopted line-Aston formations where aircraft flew one behind another with significant spacing, allowing each pilot to cover the aircraft ahead while scanning for threats. These formations were less impressive-looking than tight Vics, but pilots survived longer. Number 2, 42 Squadron, a Canadian unit commanded by Squadron Leader Douglas Bader, experimented with various formation modifications throughout the Battle of Britain. Bader was an unusual officer, a fighter pilot who had lost both legs in a pre-war flying accident and returned to service when the war started. He was aggressive, opinionated, and increasingly convinced that RAF tactics were obsolete. But even Bader, who would later become an advocate for Finger 4 formations, couldn't implement radical changes in the summer of 1940. Fighter Command doctrine took precedence over squadron-level innovation. The crisis came in late August and early September. RAF Fighter Command was losing pilots faster than Training Command could replace them. The German attacks were relentless. Airfields were being bombed, aircraft were being destroyed on the ground. Pilots were flying 4 and 5 missions per day and developing combat fatigue that made them less effective even when they survived. On September 7th, the Luftwaffe shifted its primary target from RAF airfields to London. This decision, often portrayed as a strategic mistake by German commanders, actually gave Fighter Command time to recover. While the Luftwaffe pounded London with hundreds of bombers escorted by masses of fighters, RAF squadrons had breathing room to rebuild, to train replacement pilots, and to experiment with tactics. September 15th, 1940, became known as Battle of Britain Day. The Luftwaffe launched 2 massive raids against London, throwing everything available into what they hoped would be a knockout blow. RAF Fighter Command responded with every aircraft they could put in the air. Fighting was fierce and confused, with hundreds of aircraft engaged simultaneously over southern England. The RAF claimed to have shot down 185 German aircraft that day. The actual number was closer to 60, but even 60 losses in a single day was unsustainable for the Luftwaffe. More importantly, the Germans had failed to achieve air superiority. The RAF was still operational, still fighting, and showing no signs of collapse. 2 days later, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, indefinitely. The Battle of Britain was over, though bombing raids continued for months. Fighter Command had won, but the victory came at enormous cost. 544 RAF aircrew were killed during the battle. Another 422 were seriously wounded. The total casualty rate among Fighter Command pilots exceeded 30%. Post-war analysis of loss patterns during the Battle of Britain revealed something RAF commanders already suspected. Pilots flying in tight Vic formations had significantly higher casualty rates than pilots in looser formations. More than half of all fighters shot down were aircraft that had become separated from their formations or were the tail-end Charlie positions, the rearmost aircraft that German pilots targeted first. The squadrons that adopted looser formations, even informally, had better survival rates. The veterans who had fought over France and learned painful lessons about German tactics survived longer than freshly trained pilots flying by the book. The evidence was overwhelming. The Vic formation was obsolete. But changing official doctrine required more than anecdotal evidence. It required someone with enough rank and credibility to challenge Fighter Command orthodoxy. That someone was Douglas Bader. By November 1940, Bader had been promoted to Squadron Leader and given command of 242 Squadron. He had shot down 13 enemy aircraft during the Battle of Britain, earning the Distinguished Flying Cross and establishing himself as one of Fighter Command's most successful pilots. He was also developing strong opinions about tactics. In early 1941, Bader began advocating for changes to Fighter Command formation flying. He had studied German tactics and recognized that the swarm formation was superior. He couldn't implement German tactics exactly. Fighter Command wouldn't accept a formation with a German name in the middle of a war against Germany. But he could adapt the principles to British needs. In March 1941, Bader was promoted to Wing Commander and given command of the Tangmere Wing, consisting of 3 Spitfire squadrons. This gave him authority to implement formation changes at wing level without waiting for Fighter Command approval. He immediately began training his squadrons in what he called the Finger 4 formation. The name was deliberate. Bader had observed German swarm formations over France and noticed that from above, the 4 aircraft looked like fingertips on a spread hand. The formation was identical to the German version. 2 pairs of fighters with wide spacing, mutual support, and flexible tactics. But calling it the Finger 4 instead of the Schwarm made it sound like a British innovation rather than copied German tactics. Bader's wing flew the Finger 4 formation operationally beginning in May 1941. The results were immediate and dramatic. His pilots reported much better situational awareness. They could scan continuously for threats instead of focusing on formation keeping. They spotted German fighters earlier and positioned themselves advantageously more often. Most importantly, they weren't being bounced from behind anymore. Bader's success attracted attention from other wing commanders. By summer 1941, several wings were experimenting with Finger 4 formations. The formations looked different from traditional Vics, looser and less organized, but the combat results were undeniable. Wings flying Finger 4 formations were shooting down more German aircraft and losing fewer of their own pilots. Fighter Command officially adopted the Finger 4 formation in 1942, making it standard doctrine for all fighter squadrons. The transition took months. Pilots trained on tight Vic formations had to unlearn ingrained habits. Squadron leaders had to accept that wingmen needed freedom to scan instead of rigid formation discipline. But by the end of 1942, the entire RAF fighter force was flying variations of the formation that the Luftwaffe had pioneered in Spain 4 years earlier. The impact on RAF effectiveness was substantial. Loss rates dropped. Kill ratios improved. More importantly, RAF pilots reported feeling more confident and more in control of combat situations. They could see threats coming instead of being surprised. They could maneuver aggressively without worrying about hitting wingmen. The formation did exactly what it was supposed to do: maximize situational awareness and mutual protection while maintaining tactical flexibility. The United States Army Air Forces adopted the Finger 4 formation even more enthusiastically than the RAF. American fighter pilots training in 1941 and 1942 learned Finger 4 tactics from the start. They called it the fighting pair. 2 aircraft working together, or sometimes the fluid four aircraft in a flexible formation, but the concept was identical to Mulders's Schwarm and Bader's Finger Four. American P-38, Lightnings, P-47 Thunderbolts, and P-51 Mustangs flew in Finger Four formations throughout the war in Europe and the Pacific. The formation worked equally well for escort missions, where fighters protected bombers, and for fighter sweeps, where fighters hunted enemy aircraft. The flexibility of the formation meant it could be adapted to any tactical situation. Soviet fighter forces were slower to adopt the Finger Four, partly because of doctrinal conservatism and partly because of poor radio equipment in Soviet aircraft. Early Soviet fighters lacked reliable radios, making loose formations difficult to coordinate. But as better equipment became available, and as combat experience demonstrated the effectiveness of Finger Four tactics, Soviet units gradually transitioned away from tight three-plane VICs. By 1943, every major air force in the war except Japan was flying some variation of the Finger Four formation. The Japanese clung to three-plane VACE longer than anyone else, partly because of doctrinal rigidity and partly because early Japanese victories gave them false confidence in their tactics. But by late 1944, after suffering catastrophic losses to American fighters, Japanese units also began adopting paired formations with mutual support. The Finger Four formation represented more than just a new way to position aircraft in space. It represented a fundamental shift in fighter pilot culture. Traditional formations emphasized obedience, discipline, and synchronized attacks. Fighter pilots were expected to follow their leader without question, maintain precise formation, and attack only when ordered. Finger Four tactics emphasized initiative, situational awareness, and flexibility. The pilot who spotted the enemy first became the tactical leader, even if he was the lowest-ranking member of the formation. Wingmen were expected to think independently, watch for threats, and act decisively without waiting for orders. The leader's job wasn't to control every action, but to coordinate efforts and maintain mutual support. This cultural shift was harder for some air forces than others. The Luftwaffe and the Finnish Air Force adapted easily because they already valued individual initiative. The RAF struggled more because British military culture emphasized following orders and respecting rank. American fighter pilots, with their more informal culture, found the transition relatively natural. But regardless of cultural resistance, every air force that adopted Finger Four tactics became more effective. The formation worked because it aligned tactics with human psychology and modern technology. Human eyes and brains are excellent at detecting movement and threats if given the opportunity to scan. Modern fighters equipped with radios could coordinate without flying wingtip to wingtip. The Finger Four simply removed the obstacles that prevented pilots from using their natural abilities effectively. The mathematical advantage of Finger Four formations over tight VICs was clear when analyzed systematically. In a tight VIC of 3 aircraft, only the section leader maintained constant situational awareness. The 2 wingmen spent 80 to 90% of their attention on formation keeping. This meant that a 3-plane formation had only 1 pilot effectively scanning for threats. In a Finger Four formation, all 4 pilots could scan continuously. The lead element leader focused primarily forward and to the sides. His wingman watched behind and to the left. The second element leader covered the right side and below. The second element wingman watched above and behind. 4 pilots scanning meant 4 times the volume of airspace under observation and 4 times the probability of spotting an approaching threat before it could attack. The spacing made collision virtually impossible, which freed pilots psychologically to maneuver aggressively. In a tight VIC, any aggressive maneuver risked hitting a wingman. Pilots had to be cautious even when under attack. In a Finger Four, pilots could dive, climb, or turn violently without endangering anyone else. This made the formation far more survivable in combat. The vertical separation added another layer of advantage. Aircraft flying at different altitudes could cover each other's blind spots more effectively. A fighter attacking from below would be spotted by the high element. A fighter diving from above would be seen by the low element. And because the formation was loose, both elements could maneuver to counter threats without coordination beyond a simple radio call. The tactical flexibility was perhaps the greatest advantage. A swarm could split into two rotten at any moment, with each pair operating independently. The two pairs could engage separate threats simultaneously, support each other from different angles, or set up coordinated attacks where one pair drew enemy attention while the other struck from an advantageous position. This flexibility made finger four formations extremely difficult to counter. An enemy pilot attacking one element of a finger four would find himself under fire from the second element within seconds. An enemy pilot trying to position himself against the entire formation would be spotted by multiple pilots simultaneously and engaged before he could attack. The formation created a mutual protection zone where any threat to one aircraft immediately became a target for the other three. German pilots, who had pioneered these tactics, understood their advantages and limitations better than anyone. Werner Mölders, promoted to colonel and commanding Jagdgeschwader 51 on the Eastern Front, continued refining swarm tactics throughout 1941. By July 1941, Mölders had achieved 101 confirmed victories, making him the first fighter pilot in history to reach that milestone. Mölders would not survive to see the end of the war. In November 1941, he was killed in an air crash while travelling as a passenger to Berlin. He was 28 years old, but his legacy endured. The tactical system he had developed over Spain continued to be the standard for fighter operations throughout World War II and beyond. Adolf Galland, Mölders's contemporary and eventually inspector of fighters for the entire Luftwaffe, wrote after the war that Mölders's tactical innovations were as important as any technical development in aviation. Better aircraft, better engines, better weapons, all mattered, Galland wrote, but tactics mattered more. A pilot in an inferior aircraft flying superior tactics would defeat a pilot in a superior aircraft flying inferior tactics. Mölders proved this over Spain, over France, and over Russia. Douglas Bader, who brought finger four tactics to the RAF, survived the war despite being shot down over France in August 1941 and spending the rest of the war as a prisoner. After the war, he became a tireless advocate for disability rights and an inspiration to amputees worldwide. He died in 1982, and among those attending his funeral was Adolf Galland, his former enemy and later his friend. The relationship between Bader and Galland illustrated a curious aspect of the finger four formation. Both men had fought on opposite sides of the war, but both recognized that certain tactical truths transcended nationality. Good tactics were good tactics regardless of who invented them. The finger four worked because it aligned with fundamental principles of aerial combat. See first, maneuver freely, support your wingman. By 1945, when the war in Europe ended, the finger four formation was so thoroughly integrated into fighter operations that pilots couldn't imagine flying any other way. The tight VIX of 1940 seemed absurdly dangerous in retrospect. How had anyone survived flying wingtip to wingtip while enemy fighters bounced them from behind? The answer was that many hadn't survived. The casualty lists from the Battle of France and the early months of the Battle of Britain testified to the cost of flying obsolete formations against an enemy with superior tactics. The Korean War in the early 1950s provided the first test of finger four tactics in the jet age. American F-86 Sabres faced Soviet-built MiG-15 fighters flown by North Korean, Chinese, and Soviet pilots. Both sides flew variations of finger four formations, and the resulting air battles over MiG Alley demonstrated that the basic principles remained valid even at transonic speeds. American pilots, many of them World War II veterans, flew finger four formations that differed little from what they'd learned a decade earlier. The speeds were higher, nearly 600 miles per hour in combat, and the altitudes were greater, often above 40,000 feet, but the tactical concepts were identical. Two plane elements with mutual support combined into four-plane flights with flexible tactics. The Americans achieved a kill ratio of better than 10-1 over MiG Alley, and while superior pilot training explained much of that advantage, formation tactics played a role. American pilots in finger four formations maintained better situational awareness and mutual support than their opponents, who sometimes flew in looser, less disciplined formations. Vietnam proved more challenging. American fighter pilots initially struggled against North Vietnamese MiG-17 and MiG-21 fighters that used different tactics. The North Vietnamese often flew in pairs that broke apart rapidly once combat began, making coordinated attacks difficult. American Finger 4 formations, optimized for mutual support and sustained combat, sometimes found themselves unable to bring superior numbers to bear against opponents who refused to fight except on their own terms. But the basic Finger 4 formation remained standard. What changed was how aggressively flights were willing to break up the formation to pursue individual targets. Early in the war, American pilots tried to maintain formation integrity at all costs. Later, they learned to split elements more readily, accepting temporary loss of mutual support in exchange for better offensive opportunities. The introduction of beyond visual range missiles in the 1970s and 80s gradually made close formations less critical. If fighters could detect and engage enemies 30 or 40 miles away using radar-guided missiles, the need for visual mutual support decreased. Modern fighters began operating in looser formations spread across dozens of miles, coordinating by data link instead of visual contact. But even modern fighter formations retain echoes of the Finger 4. Combat air patrols typically consist of 2 or 4 aircraft working together with assigned sectors of responsibility. Lead and wingman relationships persist, with one pilot focused on offensive operations while another watches for threats. The technology has changed dramatically, but the fundamental principles of mutual support, situational awareness, and tactical flexibility remain the same principles that Werner Mulders developed over Spain in 1938. The last major conflict where Finger 4 formations were used in their original visual form was probably the Falklands War in 1982. British Sea Harrier pilots flying combat air patrol over the islands used classic Finger 4 formations adapted for the Harrier's unique capabilities. Argentine fighter pilots, flying Mirages and Skyhawks, also used variants of Finger 4 tactics. Both sides achieved reasonable results, demonstrating that even 40 years after World War II, the formation remained effective. The deeper lesson of the Finger 4 formation is about how military organizations learn and adapt. The RAF entered World War II with obsolete tactics because it had failed to study combat developments in Spain and Finland. The tight Vics that looked so impressive on parade grounds proved catastrophically vulnerable in combat. Only after suffering severe casualties did Fighter Command finally adopt tactics that its enemies had been using successfully for years. This pattern, stubborn adherence to familiar doctrine despite evidence of its failure, has repeated throughout military history. Organizations resist change even when change is necessary for survival. The soldiers or pilots or commanders who advocate for new tactics face resistance from superiors who are comfortable with established methods. Innovation happens, but often only after painful losses prove that the old ways don't work anymore. The Finger 4 formation succeeded because it solved a real problem in a way that aligned with both technology and human psychology. Modern fighters needed formations that maximized awareness while maintaining mutual support. Pilots needed freedom to scan for threats without worrying about collision. Wingmen needed permission to think independently, instead of blindly following orders. The Finger 4 provided all of that. But the formation succeeded also because certain individuals, Werner Mulders in Germany, Finnish Air Force commanders, whose names are less well known, Douglas Bader in Britain, had the courage to challenge doctrine and the skill to demonstrate that their new tactics worked. These men, and thousands of pilots who flew Finger 4 formations in combat, proved that tactical innovation could turn the tide of aerial battles. The statistics tell the story with merciless clarity. Finnish pilots flying Finger 4 formations achieved a 16-to-1 kill ratio in the Winter War. Luftwaffe pilots using swarm tactics dominated Allied fighters over France in 1940. RAF squadrons that adopted Finger 4 formations in 1941 had significantly better survival rates than squadrons still flying Vics. American fighter pilots flying Finger 4 formations in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam consistently achieved favorable kill ratios against opponents using other tactics. Thousands of pilots survived World War II because they flew in formations that maximized their chances of seeing threats and responding effectively. Thousands more died because they were trapped in obsolete formations that made them easy targets. The difference between survival and death was often nothing more than the spacing between aircraft and the freedom to scan for threats, instead of watching wingtips. The pilots who pioneered Finger 4 tactics, Werner Mulders and his fellow Luftwaffe pilots in Spain, Finnish aces like Jorma Sarvanto in the Winter War, Douglas Bader and the RAF pilots who pushed for tactical change after the Battle of Britain weren't trying to revolutionize warfare. They were trying to survive. They recognized that the formations they'd been taught were getting pilots killed, and they developed better alternatives. Werner Mulders never lived to see his tactical system adopted by every major air force in the world. He died at 28 in an aircraft accident, less than 3 years after developing the swarm formation. But his legacy is written in the training manuals of fighter pilots from 1940 to the present day. Every pilot who learned to fly as lead and wingman, every formation that emphasized mutual support and situational awareness, every tactical doctrine that valued flexibility over rigid discipline, owed a debt to Mulders and the handful of officers in various air forces who recognized that loose formations were superior to tight ones. Douglas Bader lived to see the Finger 4 become standard throughout NATO air forces and beyond. He spent decades after the war as an advocate for disability rights, proving that losing both legs didn't prevent him from becoming one of Britain's most successful fighter pilots. His story inspired millions, but his tactical contribution, bringing Finger 4 formations to the RAF, saved thousands of lives during the war and influenced fighter tactics for generations afterward. The Finnish pilots who developed similar tactics independently, fighting against impossible odds during the Winter War, never achieved the fame of Mulders or Bader. Their names are largely forgotten outside Finland, but their 16-to-1 kill ratio stands as testimony to the effectiveness of their tactics. They proved that a small force using superior tactics could defeat a much larger force using inferior tactics. The principle applies far beyond aerial combat. The Finger 4 formation represents a rare case in military history where a simple tactical innovation, changing how aircraft were positioned relative to each other, had strategic impact. Better tactics allowed smaller forces to achieve air superiority over larger opponents. Superior awareness prevented bounces and ambushes. Flexible formations adapted to changing circumstances better than rigid ones. All of these advantages flowed from the basic decision to spread aircraft out, give pilots freedom to scan, and emphasize mutual support over formation discipline. By the time the Korean War began in 1950, every fighter pilot in the American, British, Soviet, and other major air forces had been trained in Finger 4 tactics from the beginning. The formation was so thoroughly integrated into fighter operations that most pilots probably didn't know its history. It was just how fighters flew. The idea of flying wingtip to wingtip in tight VIX seemed absurd, dangerous, a relic of a bygone era when pilots needed hand signals because they lacked radios. But it had only been a decade since RAF pilots were dying over Britain because they were trapped in those rigid formations. A decade since Luftwaffe pilots exploited those weaknesses with devastating efficiency. A decade since Fighter Command finally acknowledged that German tactics were superior and adopted them wholesale. The transformation from tight VIX to Finger 4s happened within the span of a single war, driven by necessity and validated by combat results. The aerial warfare of World War II was ultimately decided by many factors: industrial production, pilot training, aircraft performance, strategic decisions, and pure chance all played roles. But tactics mattered enormously. The side that saw threats first positioned itself advantageously and struck before the enemy could respond one more often than not. The Finger 4 formation gave pilots the best possible chance to see, position, and strike effectively. 10,000 fighter pilots flew Finger 4 formations in World War II. Hundreds of thousands more flew them in subsequent conflicts. Millions of fighter pilots trained in Finger 4 tactics during the Cold War. The formation that Werner Mulders sketched out over Spain in 1938 became the standard by which all fighter formations were judged for half a century. In the end, the lesson is simple but profound. See first, shoot first, survive. Everything else flows from that. The tight VICs failed because they sacrificed awareness for the sake of appearance. The Finger Four succeeded because it prioritized what mattered, keeping pilots alive long enough to complete their missions and fight again. The pilots who flew in Finger Four formations, from Mulders over Spain to Bader over Britain, to countless others whose names are recorded only in mission logs and casualty lists, proved that tactics matter as much as technology. They demonstrated that questioning doctrine, even in wartime, can save lives. They showed that formations designed for peacetime parades don't work in combat against determined enemies. And they won their battles, one fingertip formation at a time, by seeing the enemy before the enemy saw them, by protecting their wingmen, and by fighting with the tactical flexibility that only a properly designed formation could provide. That's how the Finger Four dominated every dogfight, not through superior numbers or better aircraft, but through superior awareness, superior mutual support, and superior tactical flexibility. The formation that looked from above like four fingers on an outstretched hand changed the nature of aerial combat forever. And the pilots who flew, in those formations, trusting their wingmen to watch their backs while they watched for threats, wrote the definitive answer to the question of how fighter squadrons should fight: loose, mutually supporting, flexible, and deadly effective. That was the Finger Four formation. That's why it worked, and that's why it became the standard for the next 50 years. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.